Hello, everybody, and good morning. I can see that people are beginning to join us, which is great. Um, would fellow presenters please turn their cameras on? That would be lovely. As I say, welcome. Very good to be with you this morning for our landlord negotiation webinar. We were expecting John Bishop from Colin Bibra to join us, so I'm hoping he will be joining us as we sort of trundle along. But at the moment, he's not here, and I can't raise him. But I'm sure we will be fine. Okie dokie. In normal times, taking commercial space is a big step for any business, but it's unfortunate, very easy to make mistakes that could cost you dearly in the future. Not knowing how to negotiate a commercial lease is stressful for any business owner. However, with the right advice, entrepreneurs can avoid the common pitfalls, securing a deal that's right for their business, with the appropriate safeguards necessary for an ambitious startup. However, then COVID-19 hit. Many of us began to work from home. Offices are no longer being used quite so much, but the fixed costs do not stop. The rent, the rates, the utility bills, telecoms, printer costs. How do we negotiate with our landlords? I'm really pleased today that we have Jonathan Davis from Willmotts Chartered Surveyors with us. Our relationship with Willmotts goes back quite a long way, basically all to do with table football. A few years ago, we used to have an annual table football tournament every September, and I, for one, am thinking I would quite like to resurrect it. So I will be in touch with various people at Willmotts to see what we can do about that. Anyway, over to you, Jonathan. The floor is yours. We forgot to ask, do you want to do shared screen, or will you just be talking?
I'm going to share my screen.
So
yeah, I've got a nice presentation. Well, a presentation.
Excellent. Look forward to hearing it.
Thank you.
And seeing it.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Davis, and I work for Willmotts Chartered Surveyors, and I'm going to be talking you through negotiating with your landlord this morning. And I've got these slides here. So to start, I'm going to just go through rent reviews, lease renewals, lease regearing, and COVID-related concessions. It's going to be reasonably whistle-stop, time constraint, but just to give you an overview of things to take into account. So rent reviews, these are generally mid-lease. Generally, there's a pattern. Quite common, it's 10-year lease with 5-yearly rent reviews, or 12-year lease with 4-yearly rent reviews. There's no hard and fast rule. You've got lease renewals, and this is all to do with extending your lease, getting a new lease at the end of your existing one, and negotiating the terms for that. Lease regearing a lot, it's a little bit more informal. It really can relate to almost anything. Usually it relates to extending your term, in return perhaps for different incentives, different rents. We'll discuss that more shortly. And then COVID-related concessions, which, as discussed, is very relevant, particularly at the moment and in the last year when we discuss it. So I'm going to start off with lease renewals. So most leases are contracted inside Part 2, Section 24 to 28, the Landlord and Tenant Act, or the Act as it's called within the industry. And what this really means is that a tenant has protection under the Act, and that they can renew their lease. Although it can be opposed by the landlord on a number of grounds, these are really quite difficult to enact. So it does afford a good amount of protection, and it also sets out how the rent should be calculated. So it tells you to disregard improvements, goodwill. So I mean, goodwill in this context, it means if the business is doing particularly well, the landlord can't take that into account in terms of the rent. And in terms of improvements, if you've done a nice amount of work to the property, that also can't be taken into account for 21 years since those works are actually carried out. So there are other leases that are contracted outside the Act. Usually these are more officey. And what that means is that when the lease comes to an end, that you don't actually have the right to renew your lease. You can technically just be turfed out, so you don't have that protection. But it's just a more difficult way of dealing with things generally. But many landlords don't, particularly for offices where they're quite short leases. It doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. It sort of suits everybody involved. Obviously, lease renewals, all terms can be negotiated. So if there's something you don't like, if you need a break clause, if there's a whole host of different things that you want to look at going forward, this is the time to have a look at them and start negotiating them with your landlord. And another thing to take into consideration is rent-free. So if the unit was empty, then the landlord would obviously have to re-let it. They would have to spend money on agent fees, on legal fees, probably giving a rent free to the a new tenant coming in to fit out the premises, particularly if it's retail or something along those lines. So there's certainly no harm in asking for some rent free. Moving on to rent reviews, and the number one rule is read the lease, because how a rent review is operated is determined by the lease, and it very much depends on what it says in there. I mean, the first thing I look at is whether time is of the essence, because if there are any deadlines, then you really want to know about it at the outset. Indeed, some rent reviews, if the landlord triggers at a certain level and you don't respond in time, you could be started paying that rent, even if it has no bearing on anything. It's just what they've asked for. So very important thing to watch out for is time of the essence. I mean, most rent reviews are upwards only to market rent. Most of the time, they parrot actually lease renewals and the assumptions that are in them. So the same ones we just spoke about in terms of improvements, disregarding goodwill, things of that nature. Another interesting thing I wanted to raise was the user clause class E. So this is a new user clause brought in by the government very recently, and within it they've sort of compressed all the old user clauses. So we're talking A1, A2, A3, if you're familiar with them, B1. So retail units, restaurants, travel agencies, offices have all been compressed into this user clause. And this, well, when it comes to rent reviews, may change things because depending how the leases are being drafted, if you've previously had a barber shop or a retail unit, and you could only compare the rent of that barber shop to another A1 retail user, and now you can compare it to a restaurant, all of a sudden you're thinking, well, the rent's going to go up, but perhaps for no real good reason. So when you're taking a new lease or potentially even at lease renewal, it's certainly something to watch out for, and just make sure that you're abreast of the implications of that. Another common review method is RPI, or Retail Price Index, which is just with reference to this index, which essentially is inflation. So it takes into account inflation. So let's just move on to COVID concessions, which is obviously very relevant at the moment. I was only going to talk briefly, but I'll talk a bit longer on this one. Generally speaking, this time has been tough for a lot of people. Businesses have been closed, haven't been able to trade. There are a number of instances where there's a large amount of arrears. There's a moratorium in place at the moment, which at present finishes at the end of June, which prevents landlords from taking certain action against unpaid rent. As I said, at the moment that's due to fall away at the end of June. When it comes to speaking to your landlords about these issues, I mean, there's certain concessions that you can obviously ask for, such as rent-free, to pay monthly, to defer rent, and we've seen all these things happening over the last year or so. And generally speaking, landlords have been receptive and understanding to this. And I find particularly, if you're going to approach them, it's good to come to them with your accounts to show them, what the situation is, show them, how the trading's been, and explain, why you need that concession. So essentially, you can keep paying rent going forward. So just to frame it in a way that they can understand in terms of their investment as well. Moving on to lease regearing. So this is really mid-lease trying to change the term. So it can be instigated by either the landlord or the tenant. It might be instigated by the landlord who wants to develop the property and wants to have all the leases end at the same time. It might be to do with the tenant who wants to do a huge amount of, let's say, refurbishing of the space, spending a lot of money on it, but with only a short amount of time left on their lease. And in instances like that, perhaps they want to extend the lease, say, can we have another 5-10 years, but we're going to spend all this money. Perhaps the landlord will offer an incentive even because of that. Landlords generally, they like to have a longer lease. They like to have the security of that income, and it helps it helps their investment. Essentially, their investment obviously goes up in value in instances like that. Moving on to universal tips. I think the very first thing to work out is what you want to achieve, and obviously that's going to be different depending on whether it's a rent review, lease renewal, whatever it is. You need to work out what you want to achieve first, and I think that the first and the most important thing to do is to work out what your actual position is. So what is the market rent, and applying that to your property. So knowing what you're dealing with and the relative strength of your position against the landlords. So getting a property analysed, so measured it up, looking at the evidence on the market, analysing that evidence, and then obviously applying that to the subject property. And then, what's your landlord looking to achieve? It's usually going to be a two-way conversation. So, obviously, if the market rent's at a certain level, the landlord's probably going to want to push for that level if it's higher. If it's lower, he's going to want to drag his heels. He's got this investment that he obviously wants to protect. So it's also important to look at it as two parties and see whether there's a way, there's mutual ground and a way that both parties can win. Another thing to think about is covenant strength. This is all to do with the value of an asset in terms of a commercial asset. They're generally valued in terms of income streams and the riskiness of an income stream. So obviously, the less risky an income stream, the more valuable it is. So obviously, if your rent is being paid by, let's say, Tesco's, for argument's sake, then obviously that would be more valuable than if it was from let's say myself. If I've just started a new business, that's not as valuable because I'm pretty high risk, I'd imagine. Another thing to take into account is that not all evidence is as strong as others. I've been to, numerous times I've been to properties and talked to clients, and they say, well, the rent my next door neighbour's paying is X amount, but that rent was set, 15, 20 years ago and hasn't been looked at since. And that's not as strong in terms of evidence as an open market transaction conducted nearby, close to the valuation date, and it's just something else to take into account. It's just collating the relevant evidence, which will really help you when you're negotiating against somebody. And the last thing is, to take professional advice. At the end of the day, these negotiations and these agreements, that they make a big difference. That there's a significant amount of money and value in these leases, and making sure that you get it right for your business and so the business can operate in the smoothest possible way is important. So, as I say, I very much recommend taking professional advice, and that is it. That's me. I don't know if that was too fast or too slow, but
no, that's perfect, Jonathan. A quick question for you. Somebody's put in the chat box.
Sure.
What does re-gearing mean? Can you define re-gearing?
So yeah, re-gearing. I mean, it doesn't. I'm not sure I've got the exact definition to hand, but it just really talks about looking at that lease, and it's really more to do with the term more than anything else. So it's just re-looking at the terms. I mean, it's very much an informal thing to do, in as much as there's nothing that really dictates how to do it. That there's no legislation like for a lease renewal. It's not in the lease. It's just a negotiation between the landlord and the tenant. Trying to re-gear the lease, trying to change the terms to suit their purpose. So a mutual agreement, essentially.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, if you could stop screen sharing, that would be lovely. We've now, I think John is with us, and now I know he had a few internet problems, so I think he's on his mobile phone. At the moment, we can't actually see you, John, but
hey, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you. But I know what you look like, so that's all right.
Right. Hang on a minute.
No worries.
You're a famous man, John. We all know what you look like. It's fine.
Hello.
Hello.
Right. Okay, well, look, you're not missing much.
Okay, we'll just go with a black
You can
square.
hear
That's
me.
absolutely
Okay,
fine.
all right. Okay, look, thanks for inviting me along this morning. Some of you will know me, but just in case you don't, I'm one of the directors of Colin Bibra Estate Agents, and we're based in Ealing, have a couple of offices. We deal with the residential side of estate agency, and we manage a lot of blocks of flats, estates in and around Ealing, West London. And we also manage a lot of individual properties under short hold tenancies. Now, it's been for us and for most of us, obviously, a very challenging year, particularly for tenants and landlords. Tenants a year ago were protected from eviction by the government, which we understood why they did this. However, there was quite a major impact on some landlords. We had one in particular, which had a particularly naughty tenant who owed a lot of money in rent arrears. And we had an eviction order through the courts. And unfortunately, the government then decided to ban all evictions. And it's taken over a year to finally get this person out of the property. Cost a huge amount of money. And this is just one instance. And there's been a huge amount of this going on. It's they introduced the government a notice period, which used to be 2 months notice, a section 20 notice. That was increased to 6 months, which meant that a landlord had to give a tenant a minimum of 6 months notice if he wanted it to leave his property. That now has been reduced as of the 1st of June, will be reduced to 4 months. So there's a lot of change happening at the moment in the residential side of estate agency. There are more changes coming. The government are currently looking at actually getting rid of the notice completely on assured short hold tenancies. It means that in effect, tenants will have the right to stay in a property almost indefinitely. The landlord will only be able to get that tenant removed from the property unless the landlord will have to follow very strict protocol in trying to get his property back. He would have to have a good reason for wanting the tenants out of his property. It could be that the landlord maybe wants to sell that property. He may want to move back in himself, or the tenant is in breach of the tenancy agreement. So these are pretty major and very, very significant changes, which will be happening, we believe, at the end of this year. And it's very important for landlords to realise that this is definitely going to happen. I had something through this week from Ealing Council, who are now intending to licence all rented properties within the borough of Ealing. Again, this will have quite significant effects on landlords, because we have actually, as a company, dealt with some of these a few years ago. And the questions that the council will require from either the agent or the landlord can be quite intrusive. When we filled these forms in a little while ago for some of our landlords, and these were in specific areas of Acton, so it wasn't right across the board. The sort of questions that the council required were, for instance, did the landlord have a criminal record? What sort of mortgage? How much did he owe on his mortgage? And these are our requirements. The licenses we did obtain for the landlords, they were cost around, I think, £750 a time. We managed to get a discount. The license did last for 5 years. But again, electrical checks will have to be in place. Health and safety has to be in place for these particular properties. But as I say, this is going to come, and it's going to be across the board. So major changes are happening now. There's a big move to support tenants. And I think one of the effects will be to force or get smaller landlords that maybe only have one property or two properties, which they perhaps got rented out as an investment or for their an additional income when they retire, I think there's a good chance that these landlords will maybe be forced to leave the market. And unfortunately, that's going to put rented property, in my opinion, into the hands of much larger companies. So huge changes coming, very important to be aware of them. And I think that there's huge significant changes coming, and they're very close now. That's really all I can say, except the market, strangely enough, has been very busy. There is a strong demand for rented property. It's definitely a bounce back since a year ago. So all the estate agents that I'm meeting locally are all saying that they are extremely busy. So we've had a good year, despite the stress, despite dealing with a lot of anxiety with tenants and with landlords. It's a year that, as I say, has been challenging in lots of ways, but fortunately for most of certainly the market that I'm aware of around West London has been very buoyant and very strong. That's all I can say, really.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And I'm one of those people that just own one little flat in Barnes, which I rent out. So I will be having a private conversation with you about that. There's a question in the chat box. I think this is for Jonathan. Due to COVID, we've been closed since January, requested rent-free and assistance, but landlord does not want to know. How do we get around this situation? Surely it's a question of negotiation, I would have thought, but over to you.
Exactly, yes, a question of negotiation. It's a really tough one. I mean, you know, if the landlord doesn't want to know, it's very difficult to force him or her, force them. It's difficult. The government have, or particularly the RICS have a service, but it would require the landlord to actually want to take part, and it's non-binding. I mean, essentially, it really is down to negotiation. You know, you're not the only person in this predicament, unfortunately. And it's all really going to come to a head when the moratorium ends. And yeah, it's really going to be a matter of really trying to speak, tenants and landlords speaking to each other. And at the end of the day, you know, do landlords want to you know, get rid of tenants who have been there for many years paying rent and end up with an empty shop in a situation where there might be a lot of empty shops? And I think that, I mean, if you've got to almost put it that way, I think it's going to be a very stressful time when this moratorium ends. I mean, it might not end. It's been extended a few times already. And they're talking about potentially doing it in a phased way. No one really knows how it's going to look yet, to be completely honest with you. So it's a little bit, it's tricky. It really is tricky. I mean, it's negotiation that it comes down to.
Thank you. Sorry, Alan, I forgot to ask you to speak. Alan, do you want to say a few words? Sorry, I'm all over the place this morning.
No problem. It's fine. I was very interested in listening to Jonathan and John's presentations and comments because it's going to be a really difficult time for a lot of people going back to work, opening up their shops again, trying to work out how they've got to try and get business back up and moving again, and especially paying rents for properties where a lot of the time now retail has moved to online sales, and people who do online sales don't have the overhead of running a shop. So my experience is the best way to negotiate is to come to an amicable agreement that benefits both sides. If it's one-sided, it never really works in the long run. So do you think that the best way for landlords to be negotiated with for better rent over a longer term is for, instead of the one shopkeeper or the one shop or the one property owner to come along and say, look, you know, I need some help with this. Here's my books. This is what my income stream looks like. I can't afford to pay you. How do you sort of negotiate that with a landlord?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So you would just, yeah. So you would ask. I think first off, you need to, figure out what you want. So, do you want that rent free? Do you want what do you need? I think is actually the real point is, what do you need to tide you over this period of time? And then obviously you've got to go and ask for it with those accounts and say to him, at the end of the day, when it comes to it, the landlord's got a choice to make when the moratorium comes to an end. Will they get rid of the tenant if they're not paying rent and they're in arrears, if they haven't paid that rent, or will they stick with them and come to an agreement with them on those arrears? Obviously it's not a good position to be in, whereby rent unpaid and you are almost at the mercy of the landlord there because of that, for that recourse that they can do that with the tenant. And it's just
It sounds like
it's very difficult. It's a big challenge at the moment, massive challenge at the moment.
you're definitely putting your neck on the block when you go into that negotiation and say, well, this is what I need. But I guess what you're saying is it's time sensitive as well. Getting somebody into that shop to replace you is going to take a while. So why not accept a shorter term rent in the short term and then agree to go back to the normal level of rent in the medium and longer term? And if the landlord can see that they've got that dip back down and back up again, then they may just do that. But isn't the answer as well, I can't do it for you because everybody else would want it. I own the row of shops outside, or I own all of those properties. How can I do this for you? Do you need to have that conversation with your colleagues who are all in the same sort of type of situation beforehand?
It's incredibly challenging. As you say, I think landlords do, they would much rather short-term pain than affecting the investment value going forward. I think that's really relevant and something that big landlords would definitely take into account, and particularly when as you say, you've got a landlord who owns a parade, and it's you offer this, and this person and that person, and it gets very, very busy, and it does become very difficult. There is strength in numbers, and you've got a number of tenants coming at the same time, then it does make it different. But to what degree? Because at the end of the day, everyone's in a lease. It's a contractual agreement. So it's just it's incredibly difficult. And it's time sensitive. This moratorium coming to an end. It's just
John Bishop, you mentioned that getting rid of bad tenants has been incredibly hard. In this type of situation, when you're trying to negotiate, presumably it's really important to demonstrate that you're a very good tenant who's previously paid his bills on time and kept the property very tidy. Will all of those things add up to helping to flip the scales over in their favour, do you think?
Yeah, it does actually. And most of our landlords have been very understanding. Where we've had tenants requesting a reduction in their monthly rent, all of our landlords have agreed. And in fact, some landlords have actually anticipated this and offered a reduction to the tenants before the tenants even requested it themselves. And our advice to landlords would be that if you have a good tenant, then it's advisable to look after that tenant, and a reasonable request in a reduction of rent. Or even in one case, we had a landlord that said, look, I'm going to give these tenants a rent-free period over Christmas. And that way you build up a good relationship between the landlord and the tenant, which in my view is a good thing to do, because that means that tenant is going to be happy in that particular property and hopefully will stay for a long time. So it's good to have a good relationship with your landlord, but unfortunately that's the ideal, but it doesn't always work, because you can have extremely difficult landlords that are not understanding, and you can have difficult tenants as well. So it really is on a case-by-case basis, but most of our experience has been that landlords and tenants have worked together in the last 12 months.
So it sounds like what you're saying is to have a really open, transparent relationship with both sides, perhaps even letting both sides see the books, understand what the income streams are, understand what the bigger problems are, but also understanding what the opportunities are in the area, in the property, in the economic cycle. And if one side can help the other get through this, then both sides stand a big chance to gain something in the longer term.
Yep.
Sounds sound to me. We have a few questions in the chat box. The first one's a really easy one. Are we going to receive recordings of this meeting? Yes, they are on our YouTube channel, usually within about half an hour of the meeting ending, because Lisa is so efficient. The next one, I think this is one for you, Jonathan. In the current COVID scenario, is there anything else a commercial tenant can ask for as a rebate without asking for rent-free or discount on rent, which the landlord may agree to more easily?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask to potentially pay monthly. That's something that a lot of tenants have done, which obviously helps with the income stream. And that's quite a good one. But I mean, I would echo what's been said just recently. It's very much a case by case basis, and you know, the different assets of you know, have very different implications as well. So you know, industrial properties is flying at the moment. And I think that has a lot to do with what Alan was talking about in terms of structural changes in the market. You know, everything's moved online, so people need, you know, a lot of warehousing space. That's absolutely flying, whereas retail's obviously struggling. So it's very much, you know, it's not a one size fits all at all. It really is case by case.
Yeah, thank you. Right, there is another question. Is there any advice re deposits for a new lease? And I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, but any advice on deposits?
It's probably, I mean, that might be commercial, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So deposits for a new lease, deposits are there to indemnify the landlord, essentially in case the tenant defaults. If it's a new lease, you know, it very much depends on the track record of that tenant. You know, is it a brand new company? Is it, you know, are you going to guarantee the rent? It all sort of comes together for that. So I mean, 3 to 6 months, something on those lines is fairly standard. But it really does depend on how the landlord perceives the risk of that new tenant coming in, and again, it's not something to negotiate over. But, you know, sometimes what you can do so you don't tie up too much money is negotiate a deposit that actually becomes less after the tenant's been in occupation, paying rent for a period of time, so you get that money back out from that.
Okay, thank you. Right, here's one, I think again for you, Jonathan. Do you know what percentage of landlords have actually reduced rents or given rebates? Oh, well, I think really for both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite a few. I mean, I'd say most of ours have been sensible, particularly those with the retail portfolio. They've tried to be sensible, and have offered, you know, some rent free or some concessions. But you know, it is a case by case basis. It depends on the landlord, depends on the relationship with the tenant previously, as well. So yeah, but I would say that most of them have been really quite reasonable over this period.
Yeah, for us, it's probably about maybe 5-6% of our landlords have either offered a reduction or given a reduction. It's been quite small, actually, much smaller than we anticipated, because we really thought a year ago that there would be a huge drop in the amount of rental income, at least a 10% per month drop. But in fact, we personally experienced very, very few, which was good news for our landlords, and it obviously implied that most of our tenants were then working from home, so we're still in, or maybe had been furloughed. But yeah, it was very small for us.
Thank you. Alan, have you got any more thoughts, any more questions?
My only leaning is it's interesting that you say that only 5, maybe 10% of the landlords have agreed to a rent reduction. Yet in today's cycle, people are only just beginning to go back. Do you think this is something that is going to grow quite a bit, and yet it's yet to come down the line fully and arrive at people that are renting property or commercial premises.
Yeah, it's a bit of an unknown at the moment because, as I say, a lot of our tenants have probably been furloughed. What we don't know is whether they're going to be going back into full employment or made redundant. So there could be something lurking a bit further down the line where suddenly there's a lot more redundancies. Therefore, we could possibly see an increase in rent arrears where they're unable to pay the rent. We haven't experienced it yet.
Okay.
We're seeing from our perspective at the Chamber a huge pressure on the local village shop high streets. All of the major banks are now pulling out from their small villages, almost to only have one main branch bank for one borough in the middle of the main shopping centre for that borough, in our instance, Hounslow. So when the bank disappears from the high street, it's very difficult for lots of the other shops to stay on behind that. So they tend to see that as a bit of a flag in the ground, and everybody else can gather around it. And it's very difficult for those smaller high streets to survive with on the amount of online sales. Yet with the council and the Chamber promoting shop local, shop safe through the pandemic, we've been trying to drive more business at the local high streets, not just the main centres of town, but your local village high streets around the boroughs. So do you think there's a good idea to have some sort of working group that can help small shop owners and small office premises work closer with their people that they rent out to via independents like the Chamber of Commerce to help find that middle ground and make everybody feel that they're all on board to try and make both businesses survive, the landlord's business and the people that rent out properties?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a great idea. I mean, it certainly wouldn't hurt. Yeah, I think it's going to be quite interesting for commercial going forward, because I think working from home is here to stay, personally, at least partially. So certainly suits me. I can see Anne smiling. I live in Bushy, but I commute to Hammersmith, so that'd be in my interest to work from home a couple of days a week. But no, the point is that, you know, where I would be spending my money in Hammersmith quite centrally, I would now be spending that on my local high street, and I think that's going to be replicated quite, you know, up and down the country, really. So I think it'll be very interesting. Hopefully that will benefit, you know, local high streets, but potentially maybe not in central locations, but elsewhere.
A quick question for me: is there a website? Is there any way you can actually find what commercial rents are in a local area? I mean, for example, Chiswick, there are an awful lot of shops that change hands in Chiswick, and the rents sort of seem to go up, and then the shop, you know, so basically the rents are quite high, and then the new sort of shop owner, retailer comes in, is very excited, but basically can't afford the rent, hasn't done their homework, and then that shop after 6 months goes again. So is there a database? Is there?
I mean, there are databases. They're not really very easily accessible for the public. I mean, there's professional databases. We've got, you know, there's a company called CoStar that does has a database, and there's a few others that do. I mean, otherwise the land registry. But I mean, you know, unfortunately, or fortunately for in terms of, you know, for me, it's very, very difficult to have a look at and to, you know, have access to these resources, and you know, that the land registry is another place you can go, but obviously you only have leases over 7 years on there. But there's no real easy place where you've got a list of, you know, rate, zone A rate per square foot and what you should be paying.
Because that would be quite useful for people just to see what others are paying, you know, along the same street.
So maybe land registry. I mean, so you can download leases. So you can go online, and I'd say most retail leases historically anyway have been over 7 years. So you could get those and see what the next door neighbour is paying. I think it's £3 a lease. So and I think anyone can do that.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Alan, any more thoughts?
Yeah, I was just saying that John's had his hand up for a few minutes, Ali.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see. John, over to you.
It's just picking up what Jonathan said, actually, which I found quite interesting, because he was mentioning about shopping local. I live in West Ealing, just off of Northfield Avenue, and the local businesses seem to have been doing really well. I know we've had a couple of lockdowns, but most of us are now using the local delis, we're using the cafes, and there is a real feeling, certainly where I live, that we all now want to support local business. And local businesses, certainly, as I say, seem to be very busy, busier than I've ever seen them. So maybe this is an opportunity that certainly some of the high streets or the small local high street may actually have a bit of a resurgence and maybe bounce back. As I say, I've certainly am observing that for the last 8-9 months at least.
Yes, I'll endorse that. I live in Brentford, and Brentford High Street has never been so busy. That the local Italian restaurant last evening, you know, on a sort of miserable Wednesday evening, was absolutely full, which is lovely to see. So the, you know, we are spending our pound sort of locally, which is great. I think we've had a few more questions. This is specifically to COVID. Specific to COVID times, what support can we seek? I think you probably covered that, Jonathan. And I just wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that there are several grants available from Hounslow Council. And the place to go is www.hounslow.gov.uk/COVID-business-grants. And I'll put that into the chat box so people can sort of see that. Whilst I'm doing that, are there any more questions? Oh, hold on, Alan, are you able to check the Q&A?
Sure, I'll have a look now.
Thank you very much. Well, I just put this in the chat box.
So there's one in here from Guthan Netrikas asking, can you please share a few tips for beginners who are looking for a rented property?
I presume that's commercial.
A few tips. Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing is depending on what you want to open, picking the right spot. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the place where everyone wants to get into. I mean, I remember a few years back, there was a really nice cafe that opened up. Where was it? I forget. I should really be plugging it, shouldn't I? But no. But she opened up this really trendy new cafe, and it was on a high street right next to the underground station. But it was not the most developed high street, but you know, in terms of the area, it was a massive demand, and she's done, you know, gone from strength to strength. She didn't pay a huge rent for it, and you know, the landlord's delighted. He's got a tenant in there who's flying. And you know, it just works for everybody. But I mean, I think that's probably the most important thing, is just make sure that it's the location. You know, it really is for what you're doing. You know, if you don't need to be in a high street location, then don't pay for it, because you can obviously go somewhere which doesn't have such a high rent. So just make sure that you're paying for what you need.
What about a serviced office? Would that be an option?
So yeah, I mean, serviced office is generally more. It's got its pluses and it's got benefits and its drawbacks. So they're generally more expensive. You're reliant on the provider usually for everything from phones to absolutely everything, and you generally pay more for it. But the benefit is flexibility. So you don't have to sign up to a longer lease with all those you know, other added costs. So it depends on the situation. Yeah.
Okay. And also during lockdown, a lot of people in serviced offices had problems because they weren't paying business rates, so therefore they couldn't get rates relief. So there was quite a lot of hassle from that point of view as well. Are there any more questions?
I suppose at the end of the day, every landlord wants to see a happy, buoyant, successful person leasing his business who's making a lot of money. And every person who's leasing a property from a landlord wants to see a happy landlord that he's paying a good amount of rent to, that is allowing him to make money, and the landlord's making money without the property being destroyed and the money being paid on time correctly. If you can balance both of those sides, you end up with two happy partners. The question is, how do you balance those two sides to get to equilibrium? And I guess that's the quest that a lot of people are going to try to strive for coming out of this pandemic. And one of the answers is going to be honesty and transparency, to say, you know, for my business to get back to being successful, I need some help. There's multiple places to go. One of them is a lower rent area. Another one is to get better grants and assistance from the council. Another one is for more advertising and more signposting from the Chamber of Commerce, so that more people come along to that business. But you know, we're all in this boat together. We all want to make this area a more successful borough and boroughs to do business in. So if we can all sort of work with each other to help deliver this, my views are that that's how you can all survive and be happily with your business and deliver growth.
There's an interesting question that Sunita Punjabi has just put to us. For small businesses acquiring new commercial leases, are you aware of any help we can get in terms of advice? Sunita does have a solicitor, but if she wants a second opinion, are there any legal organisations that she can get help at no or low cost? I mean, I'm thinking Citizens Advice Bureau, but I mean, I know the wait time is quite long. Any thoughts on this, Jonathan or John?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I think. Yeah, most lawyers I know generally that they do charge, unfortunately, quite a lot. Which yeah, I mean, it must be a niche in the market for, you know, sort of a 10-minute conversation, because it would be useful. But unfortunately,
I don't know. A good local commercial lawyer is probably the best bet.
And I would think it would be worth paying somebody, you know, for such advice, because you want to get it right, rather than at the end of the day then have to sort of foot things which, you know, hefty bills which you are not aware of. I think that's all the questions. I think all the people put questions before we started, but I think most of them have actually been covered. I think the answer for commercial leases and negotiations, it is negotiate, talk, and try and reach an amicable agreement. I mean, for example, with a question here, I haven't paid my rent for the last 2 years because of COVID-19, and the landlord is now asking me, you know, for the rent. You know, please advise me what to do. I would think 2 years rent free, that's fairly generous, I would have thought.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that, I mean, 2 years would be before the pandemic. I mean, I think that it would be difficult. I don't think a landlord would necessarily look favourably upon that. I think start a conversation and see if you can find an agreement going forward, be it, you know, paying a certain amount going forward extra towards the arrears, or, you know, writing a certain amount and then seeing if they can, there's a sustainable way going forward to make it work.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're a little bit. I've got 8 minutes to go, but I'm thinking that, you know, the questions have stopped. So I'm thinking that we will end it now. So I've gained you all 8 minutes in your busy day. So I think we'll go off and learn French. So thank you very much for your time this morning. Useful, you know, an interesting discussion, and it will be on our YouTube channel within 24 hours. Please don't forget about, there are grants from available from Hounslow Council, and the link is in the chat box. Okie dokie, thank you very much indeed, one and all, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very
Take care.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.